Don't say anything. Just listen to me, my daughter whispered, her voice shaking so hard I could hear her breathing over the line, thin and uneven like she was trying not to be heard by someone standing too close. It was his sister. She said I don't belong in this family. And then she stopped, not like a normal pause, not like someone searching for words, but like something had cut the moment in half and all I could hear was silence, the kind that sits heavy in your ear, the kind that tells you more than any sentence ever could. And I didn't ask her to explain, I didn't ask who was there or what had happened or why her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it in 32 years of raising her. I just said her name once quietly, Emily, and she exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for too long. I can't talk right now, she said, softer this time, almost disappearing. I needed you to know. And then the line went dead, no goodbye, no warning, just that hollow click, and I stood there in my kitchen with the phone still pressed to my ear, staring at the coffee I hadn't touched, the steam already fading into nothing, and for a moment, I let the silence settle, not panic, not fear, just that slow, controlled awareness that something was wrong in a way that wasn't simple, wasn't small, wasn't something you fixed with a conversation at the dinner table. I set the phone down carefully on the counter, the same way I've set down every fragile thing in my life, with intention, with control, and I reached for my coat hanging by the back door, the old navy one I've had for years, the one that still smells faintly like detergent and winter air. I slipped it on, grabbed my keys and walked out without turning off the light, without finishing the coffee, without looking back, because I already knew looking back wouldn't help me understand what had just happened. And as I stepped into the cool morning air, the kind that carries that quiet stillness before a long day begins, I felt it, that same feeling I'd learned not to ignore, the one that settles low in your chest when something isn't right, not loud, not dramatic, just certain. And as I got into my car, the leather seat cold beneath me, I thought about the last time I'd seen his family, the polite smiles, the careful words, the way his sister had looked at my daughter, not openly cruel, not anything you could point to and say, there, that's the problem, but something quieter, something measured, the kind of look that weighs a person without ever saying a word. And I remember thinking then, I remember noticing it and telling myself I was imagining things, that I was being protective, that I needed to let my daughter live her life. But now, sitting there with my hands on the steering wheel, I didn't dismiss it, I didn't explain it away, I just started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, because whatever had happened, whatever she couldn't say out loud, whatever had made her whisper instead of speak, I was going to find out, not by asking questions in the dark, not by reacting before I understood, but by going there, by seeing it for myself, by listening carefully the way I always have, and fixing it the only way I know how, quietly, completely, and at the right time. I drove for 23 minutes without turning on the radio, without checking my phone, without letting my thoughts scatter into panic, because panic does not solve anything and it never has. And the road ahead stretched out in that quiet gray light of early morning, the kind that makes everything look still even when it is not, and I kept replaying her voice in my head, not the words but the way she said them, the way her voice dropped at the end like she was stepping around something dangerous. And that told me more than anything else, because my daughter has never been someone who hesitates, not even as a child, not even when she was scared. She always said what she meant, clearly, directly. So whatever had changed that, whatever had made her whisper instead of speak, it was not small. And when I pulled into their neighborhood, the houses lined up perfectly with trimmed hedges and clean driveways, everything in its place, everything controlled, I noticed something. Immediately, her car was there, but the front curtains were drawn, and that was not like her. She loves light, she always has. I parked across the street instead of pulling into the driveway, not because I was hiding, but because I wanted to see before I was seen. And I sat there for a moment with the engine off, watching the house, waiting, listening to nothing but the ticking sound of the cooling engine. And then I saw her, just for a second, a movement behind the curtain, a silhouette that paused and then disappeared, like she had stepped back quickly, like she did not want to be visible. And that was enough for me. I stepped out of the car, walked up the driveway, and knocked once, firm but not loud, and I waited, not impatiently, not nervously, just waiting, the way you do when you know someone is deciding whether or not to open the door. And after a few seconds I heard footsteps, light, hesitant, and the door opened just a few inches before stopping against the chain lock, and there she was, her face pale, her eyes scanning past me for a second before settling. "Mom," she said, but it came out like a question, like she was not sure if I should be there. And I did not answer right away. I just looked at her, really looked at her, the way I have learned to do over the years, taking in the details she would not say out loud, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hand was gripping the edge of the door a little too tightly, and I said quietly, "Open the door." Not a command, not harsh, just certain. And she hesitated just for a moment and then nodded, closed the door to remove the chain and opened it fully, stepping back to let me in. And as I walked past her into the house, I noticed how quiet it was, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that feels arranged, like something has been paused, and I set my keys down on the small table by the entrance and turned to her. "Where is he?" I asked, and she shook her head quickly. "He left early, he said he had meetings," she replied, her voice still low, still careful, and I nodded once, accepting that answer for now, not because I believed it completely, but because I was not here to argue, not yet. I was here to understand, and I walked further into the living room, taking in the details, everything neat, everything in place, but something felt off, something subtle, like the air had shifted, and I turned back to her, lowering my voice to match hers. "Tell me what happened." And she looked down at her hands, twisting her fingers together the way she used to when she was trying to say something she did not want to say, and for a moment, I thought she might not speak at all, but then she did, barely above a whisper. "She came by yesterday," she said. "His sister," she said. "We needed to talk about the future." And she swallowed, her throat tightening as she continued. "She said things, Mom, things that did not sound like suggestions." And I took a step closer, not touching her, just being there, steady. "What kind of things?" I asked, and she shook her head again, her eyes finally meeting mine, filled with something that was not just fear but confusion. She said I should think about what I am really bringing into this family and what I am not. She whispered, and the room went still again, but this time it was not empty, it was full of meaning, and I felt it settle into place, not fully, not yet, but enough to know that this was not about hurt feelings, this was about control, and control leaves patterns, and patterns can be followed. And I nodded slowly, not reacting, not escalating, just absorbing. "What else did she say?" I asked, and my daughter hesitated again, then answered. "She said some things are easier to fix now before everything becomes official." And I let that sit for a moment, just long enough to understand what was being implied without needing her to say it out loud, and then I said quietly, "All right." And she looked at me, searching my face for something, maybe anger, maybe reassurance, but I gave her neither, just calm, just certainty. "We are going to take this one step at a time," I said. And for the first time since I arrived, her shoulders dropped just slightly, not relief, not yet, but the beginning of it, and that was enough for now. I walked past her into the kitchen without asking, not because I was ignoring her, but because I needed to see how she was living now, not the version she told me over the phone, not the version she posted in pictures, but the real one, the one that shows itself in small things. And I noticed immediately that everything was clean, almost too clean, the counters wiped down, the dishes already put away, the chairs pushed in perfectly under the table like no one had sat there in hours, and I reached for the coffee maker out of habit, filling it with water, measuring the grounds the same way I always have because routine steadies people, and she stood there watching me, her arms crossed lightly over her chest like she was holding something in place. "Mom, you do not have to do that," she said quietly, and I shook my head once. "I am not doing it for the coffee," I replied, pressing the button, listening to the low hum start up, and then I turned to face her, leaning one hand against the counter. "I want you to tell me exactly how the conversation started," I said, and she hesitated again, but this time it was shorter, like she already knew I would not let it go. "She did not sit down," she began, her voice steadying just slightly as she focused on the details. "She stood right there by the window, she looked around first like she was checking something, and then she said we needed to be practical," and I nodded once. "Practical about what?" I asked, and she exhaled slowly. "About expectations," she said. "About what this marriage means for their family." And I let that sit for a moment, then asked, "Did she mention anything specific?" And she swallowed, her eyes dropping to the floor again. She asked if I had ever thought about signing anything, she said. She said it would make things simpler, cleaner, less complicated in the long run. And I did not react, not outwardly, but I felt the shape of it forming now, clearer, sharper. "What kind of things?" I asked, and she shook her head. She did not say directly, but she kept mentioning assets, responsibilities, how their family had built everything carefully over time. And I straightened slightly, the coffee machine clicking softly behind me as it finished brewing. "And what did you say?" I asked, and she looked up at me then, something firmer in her expression. "I told her I was not signing anything without talking to him," she said. And that is when she smiled. And that word smiled did not sound like relief, it sounded like a warning, and I tilted my head slightly. "What kind of smile?" I asked, and she shook her head slowly. "The kind that says she expected that answer," she replied. "Like she already knew what I would say." And I nodded again because that fit very well. And Then, I said quietly, and she took a breath before continuing. She stepped closer, not aggressively, just enough that I could not ignore her, and she lowered her voice and said, "Some things are easier to correct now than later." And I asked her what she meant and she said, "You will understand soon," and then she left. And the room felt smaller after that, not physically, but in the way information changes space, and I reached for the coffee, pouring 2 cups, sliding one toward her. "Did he know she was coming?" I asked, and she shook her head immediately. "I do not think so," she said. "He did not mention anything, and he has not called me back since this morning." And that was the first real break in the pattern, the first thing that did not align cleanly, and I took a sip of the coffee, letting the bitterness settle, thinking through it step by step, not jumping ahead, not assuming too much too quickly. "All right," I said finally, setting the cup down. "We are not going to guess what this means," and she watched me closely now, waiting. "We are going to find out." I continued, my voice calm, steady, the same tone I have used my entire life when things mattered. "No reacting, no arguing, no decisions today." And she nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction more. "What do we do then?" she asked, and I met her eyes, holding that moment just long enough for her to understand that I was not unsure, not confused. "We pay attention," I said. "And we wait for them to show us exactly what they are trying to do." I did not respond to her question right away because there are moments when silence does more work than words ever could. And this was one of them, so I picked up my cup again, took a slow sip, and let the quiet settle between us, not empty, not uncomfortable but deliberate, and after a few seconds I set the cup down and said, "We start by understanding who we are dealing with." And she frowned slightly, not confused but trying to follow where I was going, and I continued, "Not what they say, not how they act in front of people, but what they do when they think no one is paying attention." And she nodded. Faintly, her fingers still wrapped around her cup without drinking. "You think this has been planned?" she asked, and I did not answer that directly, not yet. "I think nothing like this happens in a single conversation," I said instead. "People do not walk into a room and say things like that unless they believe they have a reason to." And she looked down again, her voice softer now. "I thought I was being careful," she said. "I thought I was doing everything right." And I stepped closer, not touching her, just standing within reach. "You were," I said, and I meant it because I know my daughter, I know the way she moves through the world, thoughtful, respectful, always trying to do the right thing even when it costs her something. And that is exactly the kind of person people like that rely on, the kind who will hesitate before pushing back, the kind who will give them the space to test boundaries. And I turned slightly, looking out toward the window where the light had started to shift, the morning moving forward whether we were ready or not, and I said quietly, "When I was your age I made a mistake like that." And she looked up surprised because I do not talk about my past often, not because I am hiding anything, but because I learned early that not everything needs to be said out loud to be understood. I trusted someone to explain things honestly. I continued, my voice even measured. I believed that if I asked the right questions, I would get the right answers. And I shook my head once, not in regret but in recognition. But the truth is, people who plan things like this do not answer questions, they guide them. And she watched me closely now, absorbing every word. "So what do we do?" she asked again, and this time I answered more clearly. "We stop reacting to what they say and we start watching what they do." And I moved back to the counter, reaching for my bag, unzipping it carefully, pulling out a small notebook and a pen, setting them down between us. "We write everything down," I said. "Times, dates, who said what, who was present, anything that feels even slightly off." And she blinked, surprised again. "You want me to keep notes?" she asked, and I nodded. "Not because we are building a case," I said, "but because clarity comes from details and details get lost when you rely on memory." And she hesitated, then picked up the pen slowly, turning it between her fingers. "This feels serious," she said quietly, and I met her eyes, steady, calm. "It is," I replied, not raising my voice, not adding anything dramatic, just stating the truth as it was. And for a moment neither of us spoke. And then she asked the question I had been waiting for. "Do you think he knows?" And I did not answer immediately because that question matters not just for what it asks but for what it changes, and finally I said, "I do not know yet." And I held her gaze so she would understand what came next. "But we are going to find out before we decide anything." And she nodded slowly, the tension in her face shifting into something more focused, less fear, more awareness, and that was the point, not to scare her, not to rush her, but to bring her back to herself, to the part of her that thinks clearly, that sees things for what they are. And as I picked up my coat again, preparing to leave for now, not because I was done, but because this needed space to unfold naturally, I said one last thing before stepping toward the door. Do not sign anything, do not agree to anything, and do not let anyone make you feel like you have to decide something quickly. And she nodded again, more firmly this time, and I paused with my hand on the door, adding quietly, and if she comes back, you listen carefully but you do not answer. And that was when I saw it, not fear this time but understanding, settling in where uncertainty had been, and that told me we were exactly where we needed to be. That afternoon I did not go home right away. I drove instead to a small office park just off Route 17, the kind of place people overlook because it looks ordinary: beige buildings, narrow parking spaces, nothing that draws attention, and I parked in the back, away from the front entrance, not because I was hiding, but because habits like that stay with you when you have spent a lifetime making careful decisions, and I sat in the car for a moment, looking at the building before stepping out, because once you move, things start to change, and I prefer to understand the direction before I take the first step. And then I went inside, past the quiet reception area, past the glass door with the firm name etched neatly across it, and the receptionist looked up, surprised to see me without an appointment. "Mrs. Carter," she said, recognizing me immediately, and I gave her a small nod. "Is Daniel available?" I asked, my voice calm even, and she hesitated for half a second before picking up the phone. "He will see you," she said after a brief exchange, and I thanked her, walking down the hallway that smelled faintly of paper and coffee, the kind of place where details matter, where words on a page can shift everything, and Daniel stood up as I entered, his expression already focused, already reading the situation without me needing to explain it fully. "You do not come here unless something is serious," he said, not as a question, and I closed the door behind me, taking the chair across from him, setting my bag down carefully. "I need clarity," I replied, and that was enough for him to understand the tone, the direction, the weight of the conversation, and I began, not with emotion, not with conclusions, but with facts exactly as they happened: the visit, the words, the implication about signing something, the emphasis on assets and timing, and he listened without interrupting, only making a few notes, his pen moving slowly, deliberately, and when I finished he leaned back slightly, folding his hands together. "They are setting a framework," he said, and I met his eyes. "Explain," I replied, and he nodded. "When someone introduces the idea of signing something without specifics, they are testing comfort levels," he said. "They want to see how much resistance there is before they present the actual document." And that aligned with what I had already begun to see: the pattern, the pacing, and I asked, "And the language about correcting things early?" And he did not hesitate. "That is pressure," he said, "subtle but intentional. It creates a sense that delay is a problem," and I nodded once, absorbing that, not surprised, just confirming. "What kind of document would require that kind of approach?" I asked, and he considered for a moment, then answered carefully, "Most likely something that limits her position long-term, financial, legal, or both." And I let that settle, not reacting outwardly, just placing it where it belonged in the larger picture. "What do we do?" I asked, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering just enough to signal precision. "We do nothing immediately," he said. "We wait for them to present it, and when they do, we review it properly, line by line, without pressure, without urgency." And I allowed a small nod, because that matched exactly what I had already decided, and then he added, "But there is something else," and I looked at him. "What?" I asked, and he tapped his pen lightly against the desk. "If his sister is the one initiating this, it suggests she has a vested interest," he said. "People do not involve themselves at that level without something to gain or protect." And that thought settled into place with everything else, completing a pattern that was no longer vague, no longer uncertain, and I stood up then, not because I was finished, but because I had what I needed for now. "Keep your schedule open," I said, and he nodded immediately, understanding without needing further explanation. "Call me the moment they present anything," he replied, and I gave a small nod in return, picking up my bag, walking back through the hallway, through the quiet office, and out into the late afternoon light. And as I got back into my car, I did not feel rushed, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt something else entirely, something steady, controlled, the kind of clarity that comes when a situation finally begins to reveal itself. And I knew then that whatever they were planning, whatever they believed they could arrange quietly, it would not unfold the way they expected, not this time. By the time I returned to my daughter's house, the light had shifted into that late afternoon gold that makes everything look calmer than it really is, and I saw his car in the driveway this time, parked neatly, exactly centered between the lines as if precision alone could suggest stability, and I did not rush. I walked up at the same measured pace, opened the front door without knocking because my daughter had already given me a key months ago, insisting I should always feel welcome, and as I stepped inside, I heard voices from the living room, low but not quiet enough to hide, and I paused just long enough to listen, not to intrude, but to understand the tone, because tone tells you more than words, and his voice came first, controlled, careful. "I am just saying we should think long term," he said, and then my daughter, softer but steady. "I am thinking long term, that is why I am not agreeing to anything without understanding it." And I stepped forward then, letting my presence be known, not dramatic, not sudden, just enough that the conversation shifted naturally, and they both turned, his expression changing for a fraction of a second before settling into something polite, something practiced. "Laura," he said, standing up, "I did not realize you were here." And I gave him a small nod. "I came by earlier," I replied, setting my bag down on the chair beside me. "We had a chance to talk," and I looked at my daughter briefly, just long enough for her to know I was not stepping in front of her, only standing beside her, and then I turned back to him. "It sounds like you have something you want to discuss," I said, my tone even, inviting but not yielding, and he hesitated, not long but enough to confirm what I already suspected. "It is nothing urgent," he said. "Just something my family has always done, a way of organizing things, making sure everything is clear, moving forward." And I nodded once, as if considering that. "Clear for who?" I asked, not challenging, just precise, and he smiled slightly, the kind of smile people use when they are trying to keep a conversation comfortable. "For everyone," he replied, and I held his gaze for a moment before responding. "Then there should be no issue reviewing it carefully," I said, and he glanced briefly at my daughter, then back at me. "Of course not," he said. "We just have not finalized anything yet." And that was the first direct confirmation, not in what he said but in how he said it, and I stepped a little further into the room, taking a seat without asking, placing myself in a position where the conversation could not easily move around me. "When it is ready," I continued, "we will have it reviewed properly." And he nodded again, more slowly this time. "That makes sense," he said, but there was a slight shift in his posture now, something less certain, something recalibrating, and I let the silence settle for a moment, giving him space to decide his next move, because people reveal more in what they choose next than in what they say first, and he cleared his throat lightly. "My sister may have been a bit direct," he said, choosing his words carefully. "She tends to focus on structure, not always delivery." And I tilted my head slightly, acknowledging that without accepting it fully. "Delivery matters," I replied, "especially when you are asking someone to trust you." And he nodded. But this time he did not respond immediately, and my daughter spoke instead, her voice steadier than before. "I told her I was not comfortable signing anything without understanding it," she said, and I glanced at her briefly, not approving, not correcting, just present, and then I looked back at him. "That was the right decision," I said, not raising my voice, not softening it either, just stating it as fact. And he exhaled quietly, the tension in the room shifting again, not gone but clearer, now more defined, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. "We are not opposed to structure," I said. "We are opposed to pressure." And this time he did not try to smile, he simply nodded, more directly, more honestly. "Understood," he said, and for the first time since I had walked in, the conversation felt grounded in something real, not hidden, not implied, but visible. And that was what I had been waiting for, not a confrontation, not an argument, just a moment where everything stopped pretending to be something else and showed itself for what it actually was. I did not leave right away after that. Even when the conversation had reached a point where most people would have stepped back and called it resolved for the moment, because I have learned that the most important details do not appear when things are tense, they appear when people believe the tension has passed. So I stayed seated, calm, unhurried, letting the room settle into what it thought was normal again, and he sat down across from me, not fully relaxed, but no longer guarded in the same way, and my daughter moved slightly to the side, not withdrawn, just giving space, and I reached for my bag, opening it slowly, not to make a point, but because timing matters, and I took out my phone, placing it on the table without unlocking it, just letting it sit there, a quiet signal that this conversation was not casual, and he noticed it, his eyes flicking to it for a fraction of a second before returning to me. "There is one thing I would like to understand," I said, my voice steady. "Neutral," and he nodded. "Of course," he replied, and I leaned forward just slightly, enough to bring focus without pressure. "When your sister spoke to my daughter, did she mention a timeline?" I asked, and he hesitated, not long but enough, and then he answered, "She may have suggested sooner rather than later." And I nodded once. "Suggested?" I repeated, not questioning, just clarifying, and he shifted in his seat, adjusting his posture. She believes it is better to address these things early, he said, and I let that sit for a moment before asking, does she usually make decisions for you? And that landed differently, not aggressive, not confrontational, but precise enough that it required a real answer, and he exhaled quietly. No, he said. She advises, but the decisions are mine, and I watched him as he said it, not just the words but the way he held them, and I nodded again, accepting that statement for what it was, not fully confirmed but not dismissed either. Then I assume you have reviewed whatever she is proposing, I said, and this time there was a pause that lasted just a second longer than the others, and that was all I needed. Not in detail, he admitted. She handles the initial drafts. And I leaned back slightly, giving him space because people are more honest when they do not feel cornered. That is helpful to know, I said, and my daughter looked between us, her expression shifting as she processed what was being said, not alarmed but more aware now, more present in the conversation, and I turned to her briefly. Did she bring anything with her yesterday? I asked, and she shook her head. No, just her phone, she said. She kept referencing things, but she did not show me anything. And I nodded slowly, because that confirmed the pattern Daniel had described: testing first, presenting later, and I looked back at him. When the document is ready, I said, I would like it sent directly, not delivered in person, not explained informally, just sent. And he considered that, then nodded. That can be arranged, he said, and I held his gaze for a moment longer, making sure the point was clear. And we will take the time to review it properly, I added, and he nodded again, more firmly this time. That is reasonable, he replied, and the room shifted again, but this time it was different, less uncertain, more defined, like the edges of something had finally come into focus, and I picked up my phone, not checking it, just holding it for a second before placing it back in my bag, and I stood up slowly, not signaling the end of the conversation but setting the next phase in motion. This does not need to be complicated, I said, looking at both of them now. Clarity makes things easier for everyone. And my daughter nodded, her posture straighter than it had been earlier, and he stood as well. I agree, he said, and I believe that he did, at least in part, and that mattered because this was not about creating conflict, it was about removing confusion. And as I walked toward the door, I paused for a moment, turning back just slightly. One more thing, I said, and he waited attentive. Respect is not something you structure into a document, I continued, my voice calm, steady. It is something you show before the document ever exists. And I let that sit, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a fact. And then I stepped outside into the fading light, closing the door behind me, knowing that whatever came next would not be hidden anymore, not in the way they had intended, and that was exactly where I wanted it. The document arrived the next morning at 9:12 a.m. exactly, not by mail, not handed over in person, but as an email attachment, clean, precise, intentional, and I knew the timing mattered because people who plan things like this rarely leave details to chance. And my daughter called me within seconds of seeing it, her voice no longer shaking but still careful. It is here, she said, and I told her, do not open it yet. And there was a pause on the line before she asked, why? And I answered, simply, because we open it the right way, not the fast way. And I was already on my way back to her house when I said it, already moving, already thinking 3 steps ahead, and when I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table, her laptop open but untouched, the file visible on the screen like something waiting to be understood, and I set my bag down beside her, taking a seat without urgency. Forward it, I said, and she did, her fingers steady now, more controlled than the day before. And within moments it was in Daniel's inbox, and we waited, not speaking much, just letting the room hold that quiet focus, until my phone rang 23 minutes later, and I answered without greeting, yes, and Daniel's voice came through, lower than usual, not alarmed but precise. You were right to wait, he said, and I nodded slightly even though he could not see me. Tell me, I replied, and there was a brief pause, the sound of pages shifting on his end. It is structured as a prenuptial adjustment, he explained. But it goes beyond that, it limits her access to any shared assets acquired after the marriage unless certain conditions are met. And I glanced at my daughter, who was watching me closely now, not hearing his words but reading my face, and I kept my expression steady. What kind of conditions? I asked, and he continued. Performance-based clauses, behavioral language, vague definitions that allow interpretation later. And I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, not out of frustration, but to place the pieces exactly where they belonged. And control, I said, and he did not hesitate. Yes, he replied. Control framed as protection. And that was the phrase, the one that made everything clear, not just the document but the intention behind it, and I thanked him, ending the call without extending the conversation, because I already knew what needed to be done next, and I turned to my daughter who had not moved, not even slightly. "It is not something you sign," I said, calm, direct, and she exhaled slowly, like she had been holding that breath since the email arrived. "I thought so," she said quietly, and I nodded once. "They will expect hesitation," I continued. "They will expect questions, maybe even resistance," and she looked at me, her voice more certain now. "So what do we do?" she asked, and I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands together. "We respond clearly," I said. "Not emotionally, not defensively, just clearly." And I reached for her laptop, scrolling through the document just enough to confirm what I already understood, not reading every line, not yet, just recognizing the structure, the language, the intention, and then I closed it gently. "You will tell him that you are willing to review it properly with counsel," I said, "and that you are open to fairness but not to ambiguity," and she nodded, repeating softly, "Not to ambiguity," and I met her eyes, steady, grounded. "And you will say it once," I added. "No long explanations, no back and forth, just once." And she sat up a little straighter, the uncertainty that had been there 2 days ago now replaced with something else, something quieter but stronger, understanding, and I stood then, moving to the window, looking out at the same street that had seemed so still the day before, and I said one last thing before turning back to her. "They built this expecting you to feel small," I said, my voice even, controlled. "But clarity does not come from being loud, it comes from knowing exactly where you stand." And she nodded again, this time without hesitation, and in that moment the balance shifted, not dramatically, not visibly, but completely, because now we were no longer reacting to what they were doing, we were defining what would happen next. He read her message twice before responding. I could tell by the pause, by the way he stood near the edge of the kitchen instead of sitting down, his phone still in his hand like he was weighing every word before sending it, and when he finally spoke it was not defensive, not dismissive, just quieter than before. "She sent me what she wrote," he said, looking at my daughter, "about reviewing it properly." And my daughter nodded once, her voice steady. "I meant it," she replied, no hesitation, no softness added to make it easier for him, just the truth as it was, and I remained where I was by the window, not stepping into the center of the conversation, not leading it, because this was the moment where it had to be theirs, not mine. And he exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in a way that was less controlled than anything I had seen from him before. "I did not realize how it would come across," he admitted, and that mattered, not as an excuse but as a shift, and my daughter held his gaze. "It did not feel like a conversation," she said. "It felt like a decision that had already been made." And he nodded more firmly this time. "That is fair," he said, and there was a silence that followed, not empty but necessary, the kind that allows something real to settle in place, and then he added, "My sister has always handled things like this for our family. I trusted her process without questioning it." And I turned slightly at that, not interrupting, just acknowledging the honesty in it, and my daughter spoke again. "I am not part of a process," she said quietly. "I am part of this family too." And that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because she was no longer reacting, she was defining her place, and he saw it. I could see it in the way his posture changed, the way his expression softened, not out of politeness, but out of understanding. "You are right," he said. And I should have made that clear from the beginning. And I stepped forward then, not to take over, but to anchor what had just been said. "Clarity now will save you both from confusion later," I said, my voice calm, measured, and he nodded, looking at me directly this time. "I agree," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no performance, just agreement, and he set his phone down on the table, a small action but a meaningful one, signaling that this was no longer something happening outside the room, but something being handled within it. "We will revise it," he said, turning back to my daughter, "together, with full transparency, and only if it reflects both of us equally." And my daughter did not answer immediately. She held that moment, just like I had taught her, letting the weight of his words settle before responding. "That is all I wanted," she said finally, and there was no anger in it, no lingering resentment, just clarity, and I watched them both for a second longer before stepping back again, giving them the space to continue without me, because this was not about winning, it was about restoring balance. And later that evening as I drove home, the sky already dark and the road quiet, I thought about how easily things like this can break if they are handled carelessly, how quickly trust can be replaced with doubt, and how rare it is for people to step back and choose understanding instead of control. And when I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, I sat there for a moment in the silence, the same kind of silence I had heard at the beginning of all this, but different now, not heavy, not uncertain, just still, and I realized something simple and certain, something I had known for a long time but rarely needed to say out loud, that respect is not something you demand, it is something you make impossible to ignore by the way you stand your ground quietly, clearly, and without ever needing to raise your voice.